C. Implementation of certain certification process. After October 30th, 1991, each railroad is in operation on that date shall designate in writing any person that it deems qualified as a designated supervisor of locomotive engineers. Each person so designated shall have demonstrated to the railroad through training, testing, or prior experience that he or she is knowledgeable, skills, ability to be designated as supervisor of locomotive engineers. No later than November the 1st, 1991, each railroad should designate in writing all persons that will be deemed to qualify as certified locomotive engineers. The purpose of initial compliance with paragraph D in the section, except for the provided in paragraph H in each section of this section. Each person designated each person so designated shall have demonstrated to the railroad through training, testing, and prior experience that he or she is knowledgeable and skills and certified locomotive engineer. Each railroad shall issue no later than December 31st, 1991, a certificate that applies to the statutes, the statutes stated 240, 223 to each of the persons designated as qualified under the provisions of paragraph B of this section. No railroad shall permit or require a person designated qualified for a certification under the provisions of the paragraph of this section to perform services as a certified locomotive of a train service or a train service engineer for more than 36-month period being the date of the compliance with the mandatory process of the testing evaluation set forth applicable provisions of paragraph E, F, and G of the sections unless the person has been determined to be qualified in accordance with the procedures of complying with subpart C. After December 31st, 1991, no railroad shall permit or require any person to operate a locomotive in any class of locomotive train or train services unless the person has been certified or qualified after December 31st, 1991, no railroad shall permit or require any person to operate a locomotive in the class of locomotive training or train service unless the person has been certified or qualified locomotive engineer and is issued a certificate that complies with 240 23. After December 31st, 1991, no class of 1 railroad, including National Railroad Passengers Corporation or Railroad Provision Commuter Service, shall designate any person it deems qualified as a designated supervisor of locomotive engineers initially certify or recertify that a person, a locomotive engineer, is either in either locomotive or training service unless the person has been tested, evaluated, determined by the qualifying in accordance with the procedures that comply with subpart C. In May 31st, 1992, no class 2 railroad shall designate any person it deems qualified designated supervisor of locomotive engineers initiating, certifying, or recertifying as a person of locomotive in any case of the locomotive training service unless the person has been tested, evaluated, determined, and qualified in according with the procedures that comply with the subpart C. G. On November 30th, 1992, no Class 3 railroad, including switching or terminal or other railroad otherwise classified as, shall designate any person deemed qualified as designated supervisor, locomotive engineers, initial certified, recertified as a person, a locomotive engineer in any class of locomotive training service unless the person has been tested, evaluated, determined to qualified in accordance with the procedures that comply with subpart C. H. A railroad may continue to designate any person it deems qualified as a designated supervisor or locomotive engineers or as a certified engineer on the basis of the paragraph B, determination of the prior to pertinent date in which the railroad is in its class must comply with the procedures of the testing evaluating persons required for the subpart C. Each person designated as a locomotive engineer shall be issued certified and complies with 240-223 prior to the being required permitted to operate locomotive. Any railroad commencing operation prior to the pertinent date of the compliance with the railroad is of its class may designate any person to be deemed qualified as a designated supervisor, locomotive engineer, or certified locomotive on the basis of paragraph on the pertinent date of the compliance with the procedures of the testing evaluating required under the subpart C. Each person designated a locomotive engineer shall be issued a certificate that complies with 240-23 prior to the being required of the permit to operate the locomotive. 240-203 determinations required as a prerequisite to the certification, except for provided in paragraph C after the pertinent is specified in paragraph E, F, and G in 240-201. Each railroad prior to the initial certification or recertification, any person as an engineer or any class of service shall be in accordance with the Federal Railroad Administrative approved program, determining in the writing the individual meets the eligibility requirements of 240-15 and to fit 17 to 19. The individual meets the vision and hearing acuity hearing acuity standard of 240-121. Individuals have necessary knowledge demonstrating the successful completion of the test that meets the requirements. The individual has the necessary applied knowledge on operating performance demonstrated successful completing operational performance test that meets the requirements of 1040-127. Where a person has not previously has certified, the person has completed a training program that meets the requirements of 240-123. A railroad may certify a person a student engineer after determining the person meets the vision and the hearing acuity standards of 240-121. A railroad may be subsequent certifying that the student engineer is either locomotive service engineer or a train service engineer without further review of his acuity status, provided it determined that the person that successfully completed with the training program that complies with 240-123, the person meets the eligibility requirements for 240-109 and 240-119. Period of not more than 24 months has elapsed since the student engineer certification was issued. Procedure determination eligibility based on prior safety conduct. After pertinent data is specified in paragraph E, F, and G in 24201, each railroad prior to the initial certification or recertification of any of the persons as an engineer for any class of service shall determine the person meets the eligibility requirements of 240-115 involving the prior contact with motor vehicle operator, 214-117 involving prior conduct as a railroad worker, and in 214-19 involving substance abuse disorder, alcohol, drug rules compliance. In order to determine the required paragraph A of this section, railroad shall have only on-file documents pertaining to the determinations referred to as paragraph A of the section, including the written document from an EAP counselor, either the documentation reflection of his or her professional opinion of the person has been evaluated or not currently affected of the substance abuse disorder, that the person has been evaluated as affected of the active substance abuse disorder is ineligible for certification. Procedure for making the determination of vision and hearing acuity. The pertinent data is in the paragraph E, F, and G in 24201. Each railroad has initially certifying recertification. Any person as an engineer, any class, shall be determined if the person meets the standard visual acuity and hearing acuity prescribed in 24121. In order to make the determination required under the paragraph A, the railroad shall have on file either a medical examiner certificate individual that has medically examined and meets the acuity standards, written documentation for the medical examiner documentation, his or her professional opinion of the person does not meet both acuity standards stating in the basis of his determination. The person nevertheless certified under the certain conditions. The person acuity is such that he or she can safely operate a locomotive even when conditions within conditions attached. Any examination required for the compliance of this section shall be performed under the supervision of medical examiner, licensed physician, assistant, such as licensed optometrist, a technical responsible person may perform a portion of examination pertaining to the visual acuity. A licensed certified otologist, technical response for the person may perform the portion of the examination that pertains to the hearing acuity. Examinations required under this section disclose the person the corrective lenses hearing of the both either to meet the threshold actuality level established by 241-121 to meet the lower threshold determined by the railroad's medical examiner to sufficient safely operate the locomotive train on the road. On the railroad, the facts should be noted: the certificate issued in accordance with the prior revision of the part. Any person that with certificate notation shall relevantly correct device with the operating locomotive and the locomotive in the train service under the railroad's medical examiner. Some determines the writing of the person can safely operate without using the device. Proceedings that make determinations of knowledge. Okay. Procedures for making determinations of knowledge after the pertinent due to the paragraph of the E, F, and G, 24201, each of the prior railroad prior to the initial certification and recertification. Any person as an engineer class with train or locomotive services shall determine the person in accordance with the requirements of 24125 that this part demonstrates sufficient knowledge of the railroad rules, practices, and safe operation trainings. In order to make the determination required for the paragraph A, the railroad shall have the written documentation showing that the person either one exhibited his or her knowledge achieving for the passing grade in the testing complies with this part. 2, did not achieve the passing grade in such a test. That C, if a person fails to achieve the passing score under the testing procedures required by this part, no railroad shall permit require the person to operate a locomotive as a locomotive or a train service engineer prior to the person achieving the passing score during a re-examination of his or her knowledge. Procedures for making determination of performance. A pertinent date for specified in EFG and 24201 each railroad prior to the initial certification or recertification. Any person that engineers for any class of the train of locomotive services shall determine that the person has been demonstrated in accordance with the requirements of 24127 in the skills, safety of the operated locomotives, locomotive training, locomotives or trains, including the proper application railroad practices, safety operation, locomotive trains, or in the most of the demand class type of the services person will be permitted to perform. In order to make the determination, a railroad shall have a written documentation showing the person either exhibited his or her knowledge of achieving the passing grade in the testing that complies with this part. 2, did not achieve the passing grade in such a testing. C, if a person fails to achieve the passing score under the testing evaluation required for the part, no railroad shall permit the required the person to operate a locomotive as a locomotive training service engineers prior to the person achieving the passing score during the re-examination of his or her performance skills. No railroad shall permit and does designate supervisors, locomotive engineer, testing, examination, evaluation, and his or her performance skills when complying with this section. Procedures for making determination of completion of the training program. After pertinent date, procedure for determination of a completion of the training program. After the pertinent date specified in paragraph E, F, and G in 24201, each paragraph prior to the initial issuance of the certificate, any person as a trained locomotive services engineer shall determine the period in accordance with the requirements of 24123 of this part, and the knowledge, skills to safely operate a locomotive train and more must demand in class the type of the services that the person will permit to perform. In making a determination, railroads shall have the written documentation showing that the person complied with the training program that complies with 24123 of this part. 2, the person determines his or her knowledge, skills in achieving the passing grade under the test and evaluation proceeding for the training of the program. 3, the person is familiar with the physical characteristics of the railroad and pertinent segments. Retaining information for supporting determinations after pertinent data. This paragraph E, F, and G in 24201. The railroad that issues, denies, or revokes a certificate after making a determination required by the 24203 shall maintain a record of each certified engineer applicant. Certification contains the information railroad relied on in making determination. The information concerning eligibility of the railroad shall retain it. Include 1, any relevant data that the railroad records concerning the person prior to the safety conductor, any relevant furnished in any other railroad, any relevant data furnished government agency concerning the person's motor driving record, any relevant data furnished for the person seeking certification concerning his or her eligibility, information concerning the vision, hearing, acuity of the railroad shall be retained, includes the relevant testing results, data concerning acuity, if applicable, relevant data concerning the professional opinion of the railroad medical examiner, adequacy of the person, equipment, the person's acuity. The information concerning the demonstrated knowledge of the railroad shall retain and includes 1, any relevant data for the railroad records concerning the person's successful or failure of the passage of knowledge of tests, sample copy of the written knowledge of tests, administrative. E, the information concerning demonstrated performance skills that railroad shall indicate include 1, the relevant data from the railroad records concerning the person's success, failure of the performance skill test, MS documents, relevant operating facts of which the evaluation is based in accordance to the observation, evaluation, and evaluation of the design designated by the supervisor or locomotive engineers. 2, if the railroad relies on the use of locomotive operation simulator conducting the performance skill testing required under this part, the relevant data of the railroad records concerning the period of success and failure of the performance skill test, that documents relevant to operating the facts of determination of the base, including the observation and evaluation designated supervisor for locomotive engineers. The relevant data of the railroad records are concerning the person's failure on the test of the records performed, the monitoring, engineering, operating performance in accordance with statute 240. 129, and if the railroad is relying to successful completion of the approval training program conducted by another entity and railroad, shall be maintain a record for each certified engineer that contains relevant data furnished for the training entity concerning the person's demonstration of knowledge, performance skills, and relied on the railroad making determinations. If the railroad is relying on certification discussing initial made of another railroad, the relaying railroad shall maintain a record for the certified engineer to continue the relevant data furnished in other railroad which was relied on making its own determination. All records under this section should be retained in the period of the 6 years of the date of certification, recertification, denial, revocation, decision shall be made available to Federal Railroad administrative representatives upon the request for normal business hours. It shall be unlawful for any railroad to knowingly or any individual willfully may cause to participate in making a false entry on the records required of the section, otherwise falsely such records through material misstatements, omissions, or mutilations. Nothing in section precludes the railroad maintaining that information required to be retained under this section electronic format provided. The railroad adequately limits the controls of those who have access to such information. The railroad employs a system of data storage that permits responsible access, retrieval of information to use the format which requested for the furnished data of the railroad representatives. Information of the retrieved system can easily be provided in printed format of the readily provided the Federal Railroad representatives authenticated designated representative of railroad with a true accurate copy of the railroad's records and requested Federal Railroad representative. 242.17 Time limitations on making determinations. After pertinent date of the paragraph E, F, and G 242.01, a railroad shall not certify or recertify a person qualified locomotive engineer in any class of the train or engine service if the railroad is making a determination concerning eligibility data for the relied of the furnished more than 180 days before the date of the railroad certification, a determination concerning visual hearing acuity medical examination being relied on the conduct more than 180 days before the date of the railroad certification decision is a determination concerning demonstrated knowledge examination being relied on as was conducted more than 360 days before the date of the railroad certification. 4. A determination concerning the demonstrated performance and the performance skill testing is relied on the conduct more than 360 days before the railroad certification decision. Time limitations paragraph of the skill section do not apply for the railroad making certification decision. Reliance the determination is made on another railroad in accordance with the paragraph C2 of the section 242.27 and 242.29, except for the provided 242.01 concerning implementation dates. Initial certification decision paragraph of this section. No railroad shall certify a person as a qualified locomotive engineer or for an interval more than 36 months. Reliance certification issued in another railroad is more than 12 months old. Except for as provided in 242.01 concerning the initial implementation of the program, a railroad shall issue the person designated certified locomotive engineer certify that it complies with 242.23 no later than 30 days the date of the decision certifying and recertifying that person. Denial of certification. A railroad shall not notify a candidate for certification for recertification of information known for the railroad that forms the basis of denying the person of certification to provide the person with a reasonable opportunity to explain or rebut the adverse information of the writing prior to denying the certification. The section does not require the further opportunity commitment of the railroad denying that it is based on sole factors addressed in 241.15, 241.17, and 241.19. Opportunity to comment afforded the sections of that has been provided. C. If it denies a person of certification or recertification, railroad shall notify the person adverse to the decision explaining the written and the basis for its denial decision. Document examining the basis of the denial shall be mailed and delivered to the person within 10 days after the railroad decision and shall be given the date of the decision. Identification qualified person persons. After November 1st, 1991, a railroad shall maintain a written record identifying each of the person designated as a supervisor of locomotive engineers. After number 1, 1991, railroads shall maintain a written record of identifying each person designated as a certified locomotive engineer. This listing certified engineer shall indicate the class of service of the railroad, determines each person is qualified to perform, and date of the railroad certification decision. If the railroad responsible for the controlling of the joint operation territories listing that shall include the person certified in accordance with 242.29, listing the required paragraphs A, B, and C shall be updated at least annually. The required under the section shall be kept in the division of the regional headquarters, and the railroad shall be available for the inspection copying the Federal Railroad Administrative during the regular business hours. A railroad may obtain approval for the Federal Railroad Administration maintaining the record, electronically maintaining the record on the record's general offices. Both requests of approval shall be written in the Associated Administrative of the Safety and containing the sufficient information to explain the Federal Railroad will be given access to the data of the full equivalent of created compliance with the paragraph. 240.23 criteria certification. A minimum each of the certificate is compliance with the part as shall 1. Identify the railroad as issuing it. Identify the railroad that is issuing it. Indicate the railroad acting conforming the perform to determine the person to whom it is being issued to determine the qualified operating locomotive. Qualified to operate the locomotive. Identifying the person to whom it was being issued, including the person. The name, date, and birth, and employee identification number, either the physical description, photograph, or person, identifying the condition limitations, including class service conditions, alumni, vision, hearing, acuteness deficiencies, and the restricting the person operational authority. 5, show the date of the issuing. 6, be signed by the supervisor, locomotive engineers, other individuals. 241.29, 243.03, unless the information on which locomotive engineer has in his or her possession with the operating locomotive be sufficient, a small size permit being carried in an ordinary pocket wallet. Each railroad to which is part of the applies designated the writing in any person that supervises locomotive engineers that authorizes to sign the certificates described in this section designates can identify such person and the name of the job name such person by name or job title. Nothing in the paragraph of this section shall permit a railroad, including additional information, certification, supplementing certificate through the other document. It shall be unlawful for any railroad knowingly, individually, to willfully make cause to be made, participate, or making false entries, otherwise falsely of the certification that material misstatements, omission, and mutilation. Reliance on qualification determinations made by other railroads. On December 31st, 1991, any qualifications of railroad relying on another certification shall determine on the prior certification still the accordance of the provision of the prior certification was, and for the same classification of locomotive train services being issued under the section, the person has received training of the visual, observed the physical characteristics of new territory according to 241.23. The person demonstrated the necessary knowledge concerning the operating of the rules in accordance with 241.25. The person has demonstrated the necessary performance skills and concerning the operating in accordance with the 241.27. Reliance on qualification for other countries. A railroad that conducts joint operations with the Canada railroad with a Canadian railroad may certify the purpose of compliance with this part. The person qualified in the locomotive at the training service engineers provided with determined the person employed by the Canadian railroad. The person meets to exceed the qualification standards issued with the transportation of Canada as for such, and any Canadian railroad is required to comply with the regulations certifying the person is qualified to locomotive training service engineer provided determines the person employed by the Canadian railroad. The person meets and exceeds the qualification standards issued within Transport Canada for such service. 242.29 requirements of the joint operation. Except for minimum joint operations provided with the paragraph F in this section, no railroad responsible for the controlling of the conduct of joint operations with another railroad shall require any person to operate a locomotive in any class of the train engine service unless otherwise operated and certified and qualified locomotive engineers for the purpose of joint operations issued with the certificate complies with 242.23. Each railroad is responsible for controlling conduct of the joint operations with another railroad shall certify its qualified locomotive engineer for the purpose of the joint operation, making the determinations required under the subpart C of this part, relying on the certification issued by any other railroad under this part. If in controlling railroad relies on certification issued in another railroad, controlling railroads determines one that the person has certified as qualified engineer under the provisions of this part of the railroad which employs the individual. Two, the person certified as locomotive engineer other than the railroad demonstrated the necessary knowledge concerning the controlling railroad operation rules. The rules is different. Three, the person certified as a locomotive engineer other than railroad with necessary operating skills concerning the joint operation territory. Four, the person certified as a locomotive engineer other than the railroad necessary familiarity of the physical characteristics for the joint operation territories. D, a railroad that controls joint operations certifies the locomotive engineers of the different railroads complying with the requirements of paragraphs in the section, noting the supplemental certification decision of the original certificate is noted until is provided for in 242.23. A railroad responsible controlling the conduct of the joint operation of another railroad deemed the compliance paragraph of the section provides a qualified person accompanying a locomotive engineer who lacks the operation of certification during the engine operations and the joint operation territories as used in the section qualified by the means of either or a designated supervisor, locomotive engineers, or a certified training service engineer is determined by the controlling railroad for having the necessary knowledge concerning the controlling railroad operations that have necessary operating skills, information, familiarity, and physical characteristics concerning joint operations territory. The railroad is responsible for controlling conduct and joining operations in another railroad made of the certified locomotive engineers that operate the locomotive in any class of the train engineering service with the determination of the period that has certified a qualified locomotive engineer for the purpose of the joint operations. For the purpose of joint operation, minimal joint operations for the purpose of the section, minimal joint operation except for the locomotive training belonging to one railroad is being operated in the same track on which it operates the conductor of the railroad controlling the operation under the following conditions. 1. The maximum authorized speed for the operation of the track does not exceed 20 miles per hour. The track is other than the main track. Operations are conducted under the operating of that require every locomotive trainer to be proceed as the speed of the permit stopping with one half the range of the vision of the locomotive engineer. The maximum distance for the joint operation of the track does not exceed 1 mile. Subpart D, Administrations of Certification Programs.